Welcome to the 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar series. The goal of NCFCA webinars is to facilitate a platform where thought leaders and subject matter experts can provide insight on topics relevant to current debate resolutions and speech events. Our desire is to provide a platform that encourages mentorship, real-life application, and competitive excellence. Our intention for this webinar is to help provide educational context for the debate topic from our guest speaker's specific area of expertise. Please keep this framework in mind as you craft your questions and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to interact with someone who can provide subject matter expertise regarding the debate topic of fair trade versus free trade. The format of this evening's webinar is going to begin with a presentation from our guest speaker, Dr. Paul Mueller, and will be followed by a giveaway hosted by the King's College. In this giveaway, the King's College will be giving away 3 gifts of a t-shirt, a tote bag, and a phone wallet, respectively, to the 3 individuals who demonstrate excellent engagement by submitting questions through the Q&A function available on the panel at the bottom of your screen. So following the giveaway, we'll move into a live Q&A where our host will field the questions and have a conversation with Dr. Mueller based on the questions that you have submitted. That being said, please do take advantage of that Q&A function. And if you have any questions regarding technical difficulties, feel free to submit requests for help via the chat function that is available on your screen on that bottom panel as well. We have a webinar tech support team on the back end ready to help you in any way that they can. So at this point, it is my honor to invite our NCFCA host, Kim Cromer, to join us on screen as I introduce her to you this evening. Kim Cromer and her husband of 23 years, Jeff, and their 3 daughters began their NCFCA journey in 2007. And since that time, they've lived in 4 different NCFCA regions and graduated all of their girls from high school. Kim holds a master's in human nutrition from Clemson University and taught as an adjunct professor at several community colleges as well as a high school science teacher. This teaching experience crossed over into NCFCA leadership, where she has served as regional director, director of forensics, and now our executive director. So with that, thank you so much, Kim, for joining us this evening, and I will go ahead and hand this off to you as you introduce our guest speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natalia. I'm excited to be here with you all tonight. It's not an often opportunity that I get to spend on this side with our webinars. So we've had a number of excellent speakers already this season, and I'm pleased to introduce you tonight to our guest. As you mentioned, our guest is Dr. Paul Mueller. He's an assistant professor of economics at the King's College in Manhattan. Before joining King's, he completed his PhD at George Mason University. Dr. Mueller received his master's in economics from GMU, as well as a Bachelor of Science degree in economics and in political philosophy from Hillsdale College. Dr. Mueller's academic interests include monetary economics, financial markets, public choice economics, the history of economics, particularly the works of Adam Smith, and Austrian economics. He's published articles in the Journal of Private Enterprise, the Review of Austrian Economics, the Adam Smith Review, and the Quarterly Review of Austrian Economics. He's also contributed a column about Adam Smith's ideas to a Cato Institute blog. He lives in Harrison, New Jersey with his wife, Catherine, and their 3 beautiful children. So I'd like to welcome you tonight to our special guest, Dr. Paul Mueller.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Greetings to everyone here from New York City. Confess, I wish I could see you all, but the nature of the beast is that you see me. And so thanks again for the chance to talk to you tonight. My understanding is that you all are here to hear about free trade versus fair trade. This is an issue that's been around for over a decade now. It's something a lot of people care about, and I understand it's the topic of the debate topic that many of you will be debating over the coming weeks and months. So I'm going to highlight just a few of the main issues, the main topics, some of the arguments on each side, some of the points of contention. And then I very much look forward to hearing your questions and getting into more of the details of what you all are interested in. So in the debate between free trade and fair trade, I think there are several kind of competing values that people care about. Obviously, people care about economic efficiency, and that's what the market is really good at giving us, trying to get the best products at the lowest prices. But people are also concerned about justice. They're concerned about fairness. They're concerned about stewardship, stewardship of resources and the environment. And ultimately concerned about human flourishing, whether workers in poorer countries can make enough in the market to have a decent standard of living, to live with dignity and so forth. So there are a number of these values that are sort of competing against one another in different ways. And depending on how you think about those things will affect where people often fall on the debate. So I'm going to kind of lay out the arguments for each side, for free trade and fair trade, and then some of the points of contention and debate. Free trade, I think the strongest argument for free trade is something that economist Deirdre McCloskey calls the hockey stick. If you look at history, the past several thousand years, the standard of living for most people has been very low and relatively constant. There's slight fluctuations. And of course, if you're royalty, you lived fairly well off. But in the past 300 years, something changed. And in the past 300 years, the level of wealth that ordinary people could have has taken off. And so most of us live remarkably comfortable lives with access to all kinds of goods and services. And this is true in developed countries, but it's also becoming increasingly true of developing countries. If you look at the global poor or the destitute, the World Bank measures them as those who live under less than $2 a day. If you look at the number of global poor from, I think it's 1981 to about 1990, there's a slight decline in the number of global poor. There's a bigger decline in the percentage of global poor from something like 40% of people around the world are living on less than $2 a day in 1981. To the low 30% in 1990. Well, if you fast forward to just a few years ago, according to the World Bank, less than 10% of people in the world live on less than $2 a day. For the first time, the number of people living on less than $2 a day is less than 1 billion. And so there's been this remarkable improvement in the lives of the poorest people in the world all over. A lot of that is in India and China. And the question is what to attribute it to. It's a historical anomaly. You know, never in human history have we seen so many people come out of poverty so quickly. And the perspective I take and many other economists take is that globalization and free trade and the expansion of markets are what are driving this, that people are leaving farms to move to cities. Wages are rising, opportunities are increasing. And so I would lay that at the feet of free trade more than anything as sort of driving that. And so the global destitute are declining and shockingly quickly. But for some people, it's not fast enough. And I'll talk about that with fair trade, that despite the number of people living on less than $2 a day declining, there's still hundreds of millions of people who are. And we'll talk about them more in a little bit. As I mentioned, our standards of living have improved dramatically in the United States and in other developing countries with sanitation, opportunities for education, the choices of what we have to consume, the amount of leisure that we have to do things like this. Lots of human benefits come with greater markets, greater technology, and greater wealth. And free trade has been one of the primary drivers of this. One thing I also want to mention for free trade is some of the concerns that we'll talk about are about sustainability. There's concerns that large sort of industrialized farming destroys the soil and sort of monocrops is ruining the environment. And there's concern about not being renewable or sustainable. Something that might be of note to you all is that in the United States, over the past several years, the amount of land that has been devoted to farming has actually begun declining. That is to say, we're growing increasing amounts of food on less land with fewer people than ever before. So when people make that sustainability argument, you want to take it with a grain of salt. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. So that's the benefits of free trade in sort of an economic, material sense. But there are other values to free trade as well that are worth mentioning. First, free trade helps us to overcome what Friedrich Hayek and other economists have called the knowledge problem, which is trying to decide what to produce and how much of it to produce, where to sell it, how much to sell it for. In free trade, people are making those decisions. They're looking at market prices. They're trying to find trading partners, and they're making their decisions about how much to grow and what to grow based on what they see in the market. Fair trade is similar, but it's less decentralized. It is to say that fair trade focuses on particular crops grown in particular ways. There's a problem of matching the people who are growing the crops and potential buyers. And again, we can talk about that more in a little bit. But with free trade, the idea is that no person, no agency decides what people should produce or what they should trade. People decide that for themselves after looking at the markets and their opportunities. You don't require certification. You don't require agencies to tell you what you can grow or how to grow it or where to grow it. And so free trade, again, as the title implies, is about freedom, right? The opportunity to make those decisions yourself. So that's a brief case for free trade. Now I'll flip perspectives here and talk a little bit about fair trade as best I understand it. So I think when people are concerned about fair trade, they're worried primarily about workers, and they can be worried about the workers in the poorer countries that are growing the crops in terms of whether they're making much money and what standard of living they have. But sometimes there's a type of protectionism that can be baked into fair trade where people are concerned about workers in the wealthier countries, that, it's difficult to compete with people who are making 1/10 of what people in the US are making per hour, or people who are working in less safe conditions or have fewer benefits. So there's some analogy here to protectionist arguments that it's very difficult for workers in wealthy countries to compete with workers in poorer countries because there's such a dramatic difference in the wage costs. And so companies are going to go to other countries to hire people. So that's a concern. There's a concern that the workers, again, in poorer countries are going to be working longer hours. Perhaps there'll be child labor involved or forced labor involved. And so there's this concern about exploitation. And the idea behind fair trade is we can have these certification boards, Fair Trade International or the American Fair Trade International Board, will go in and they'll inspect the farms, the coffee plantations, or other kinds of crop plantations to inspect the conditions, to make sure there aren't child workers involved, to guarantee certain prices for those who have the fair trade label. They care a lot about the plantations being democratically owned, so the workers have an ownership stake in the plantation itself. And then there are a few other conditions that they go in to warrant. And so the idea is when you buy fair trade, you are supporting a more sustainable, higher standard of living for these farmers, and you're not encouraging or supporting child labor or other kinds of abusive practices that unfortunately occur frequently in many third world countries. There's also more of a focus, as I mentioned, on sustainability, that many fair trade advocates will argue that these local farmers and farmers in third world countries are farming in a more sustainable way than sort of the industrial monoculture farmers in the US. And that's better for the environment. It reduces global warming. It's more sustainable in terms of the soil continuing to produce crops over time. And there's also an element in which I think they hope that this will be or will encourage community formation in these areas. So some of the money that goes through the free trade network goes towards building schools or improving the water supply and sanitation and things like that. And guarantee, again, kind of this minimum price, this sort of standard of living to help farmers in these poorer countries to make a decent wage, to make a decent living. And the idea is, by certifying this and marketing it in the United States and other developed countries, that consumers have a voice in trying to support higher standards of living for these folks and higher prices and wages for the crops that they sell. So that's again an abbreviated case for fair trade. I think the points of contention here between the two different views involve how we think about workers in poor countries and their opportunities, and workers in wealthier countries and what challenges they face. So let me tackle kind of the concern, the protectionist concern, that workers in the United States are not able to compete with workers in poorer countries who are making, let's say, 1/10 of what they make per hour. And at first glance, that's a huge advantage for poorer countries. That's a substantially lower wage cost that they have to pay. And so it's not surprising that many companies have shifted their production to overseas and to poorer places around the world. But that's not the whole story. Remember that when you're producing something, the wages you pay are not the only cost you pay. You have to build the factory, you have to provide the machines. And one thing we take for granted in the US is that we tend to have pretty good infrastructure, that you build a factory and you just connect to the power grid and you pay sort of low rates for energy. You can connect to the water grid, the sewage line. In many third world developing countries, you don't have that. And so when companies go in there to build, they have to build their own roads, they have to provide their own security. They have all kinds of other costs that they don't face in developed countries that we don't really think about. And so sometimes people will argue, this is more kind of debates about sweatshops, but they'll argue, well, companies are making profits, they're making a lot of money, surely they can afford to pay workers in these sweatshops or in these poorer countries, surely they can afford to pay them more. And the answer is, well, yes, they can, but the competition margin is very slim. If they were to pay their workers 2 or 3 times what they're paying them now, then it would actually be more cost efficient in many cases for these companies to produce in the US or in Europe or even places like Mexico. And so the margin of competition is not simply about the wage that people earn, but all the other things that go into it, the infrastructure, the legal environment, protection, and so forth. So that's something to think about in terms of the competition between richer countries and poorer countries. Another thing I'll mention, and again, there's so much we could go into, but with workers in poor countries, there is a lot of development going on. As I mentioned, the statistics from the World Bank show that the number of people living on less than $2 a day has declined dramatically from 40% 30 years ago or 35 years ago to under 10%. And potentially in the next 15, 20 years, that percentage could be almost zero. And that has been not through fair trade. Fair trade is a newer phenomenon than 1980s. And fair trade is a niche thing. That is to say, it only encompasses a small part of the trading that goes on in the world. And so by and large, the major changes that we've seen have been from more openness to trade, more globalization of factories and companies moving production overseas. And what that does is it creates sweatshops. That is to say, it creates factories where people have low wages or they work long hours. Often the conditions are unsafe or are just not very pleasant by American standards. And yet, many people choose to work in the sweatshops. And the reason they choose to do that is because their alternatives in these poor countries are not very good. The farming in these countries, they're not sitting in tractors driving around, right? They're working out in the fields in the sun, long hours for not very much pay. And so the sweatshops, often as bad as they are often better than their alternatives. And what happens over time is you have more sweatshops, is there begins to be competition for the workers' labor. And as you compete, as employers compete for that, they bid up the wages. And so economic development is actually about more sweatshops, improving the quality of sweatshops over time. Sweatshops are not a new phenomenon. They've existed in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution. For those of you who are Dickens fans, that's what he's talking about. They happened in the U.S. in the late 1800s and very early 1900s. There were sweatshops in Japan and South Korea. And then those countries developed and improved, and the competition for labor increased. So again, that's something to think about in terms of the status of poor workers in these countries and how their wages can increase over time. Two other issues, again, points of dispute between free trade and fair trade advocates are about what constitutes fair prices, right? Is the world price or the global price for a commodity, is that the right price? Or is there some kind of minimum price, almost like a minimum wage in a way, that we think is inherent to the commodity, or maybe is just inherent if we care about human dignity, that we think people ought to be paid a certain amount of money for their work or for their crops? So what's in a price? That's something to think about. We can talk about that in the Q&A. And I talk about this actually in one of my classes here about, in the history of economics, a point of contention for really centuries was, can prices be just? What makes a price just? So anyway, so that can come into play in this debate. And then finally, the environmental sustainability issues, I think, play a role. And one thing you can bring up on this is, again, I'm an economist, so I think like an economist. But when people say that they're concerned about sustainability and they're worried about depleting the soil and running out of farmable land and not being able to grow crops over a long time period as the soil is depleted, I always tell them, well, look at the price. Look at the price of crops. If people thought that was going to happen, if farmers thought that was going to happen, or large companies thought that was going to happen, that we would not be able to grow as many crops in the future, they would begin buying more crops now. You would see the prices begin to rise, because price is related to scarcity. So something to consider in these sustainability debates is what we see in prices. If prices begin rising rapidly, that would suggest, well, maybe there is a sustainability issue. But if instead they're going down, as they have been in developed countries for decades, that suggests instead that we're looking at increasing output and increasing growth of farm products, even in wealthy countries like the U.S. Okay, so all of that, brief primer to free trade, fair trade. Let me say one more thing that is going to be, I think, central to talking about these issues. And that is that the political framework within countries matters significantly. Okay, is slavery allowed in these countries? Are people allowed to own their own land, or do they have to work government land, or are there protected classes of aristocrats who own the land and everyone else is not allowed to? Are people allowed to trade in the open market? Not everyone is, and this is a problem, particularly in many African countries, that their governments prevent people from trading in the open market. Instead, their governments will say, you have to sell to us, the government, at a certain price, a low price, and then the government turns around and sells it on the open market at a higher price. In these kinds of cases, there are real problems that free trade in and of itself may not address. Now, does fair trade address it any better? I have my doubts. But we should be mindful of the political context, of the rules and the constraints that people face, because oftentimes there's political manipulation that goes on in these poor countries, whether it's forcing people to work in sweatshops, and those aren't really sweatshops, they're slave shops, really. And so we should just be aware that the political institutions, the laws, the abilities and the options that people have matter a lot in terms of their ability to benefit from globalization, from free trade, from access to developed markets. One more thing on that, the political institutions that we should keep an eye out for is whether large corporations get special deals with governments. Often governments will give tax breaks or special handouts or carve-outs to large companies that come in and either grow crops or build factories or something else. So anyway, all of that is something to be aware of in this debate between free trade and fair trade. I think I'll say one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to the King's folks to do an introduction to King's College. But one more thing to be aware of in the discussion about fair trade versus free trade is one of the things that people don't know a lot about with fair trade is that it's very expensive for farmers in third world countries or poorer countries to get the fair trade label. That is to say, they pay many hundreds of dollars to apply for the fair trade label, which is quite a bit in poorer countries. You might think it's not that much in the US, but in poorer countries, hundreds of dollars is significant. And then they apply for the label, and then the Fair Trade Organization will send in a team to inspect the farm, to make sure the conditions are met. And the farmers have to pay for that too. And they have to pay for that for the first, up front for the first 3 years. Then they have to pay annually for this fee. And that, again, is in the many hundreds of dollars. And so it tends to be very expensive for local farmers to try to get the fair trade brand. And then the fair trade brand or label, part of the process is that if you're a coffee distributor in the US and you want to get fair trade coffee, you're required to pay a minimum price, the market price plus 20 cents, I think is the most recent number. So they're getting this higher price for their coffee, but there's no guarantee they'll be able to sell it. And in fact, there have been a lot of studies showing that coffee growers with the fair trade label will sell maybe a third of their coffee at the fair trade price, but then the other 2/3 they'll sell just on the general market because they can't find a buyer who's willing to pay the premium because it's above the market price for a very similar product. And so there have been some studies, and we can talk about this more later. I think a couple German researchers have done like a 10-year study of farmers in Africa, looking at those who got the fair trade label, applied for it, and got the fair trade label 10 years ago, and those who didn't. And they followed how they did over time, and they found that on the whole, those who engaged in free trade, just trading in the market, did better than those who got the fair trade label, largely because the fair trade label was really expensive, and a lot of these farmers don't know there's no guarantee they can sell all of their crops at this higher fair trade price. So again, those are, I think, a couple downsides to fair trade that most people aren't aware of to keep in mind. All right, well, with that, I'm finished, and I will turn it over to whoever's next, and I look forward to answering your questions and continuing the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Mueller. That was very informative. I know we have the questions just pouring in as usual. So thank you, students, for engaging with the content here. There was a lot of anticipation leading up to this event. I know we even had a comment from a mother whose daughter attends King's College, and she has other students in NCFCA, and she was saying she was so excited to join us this evening via the recording later on, because she both wanted to see you because she's heard great things from her daughter, and she wanted to hear the information you had to share in preparation to teach students for this LD topic this year. So thank you, Dr. Mueller, for sharing with us this evening. We are going to be moving into the giveaway segment. So I know Tyler from the King's College is going to join us here in just a minute. But while he is getting set up, I just want to give you a few reminders about upcoming events and announcements for NCFCA. So quick product highlight. We do have our NCFCA curriculum for team policy debate. And again, the LD value debate version of the curriculum will be coming this 2019 to 2020 competition season, so you can be excited for that. We also have our comprehensive guide to speech curriculum, and all of those resources are available on the website. You can also find the webinar resources under the resource library at ncfca.org. And if you've signed up for this event, you will be getting a notification once that recording has been processed and uploaded, so you have immediate access in case you need to review and take some further notes as you research. So with that, Tyler, if you want to join us here, I know we've selected our names for our giveaway winners.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Natalia. So now I have the pleasant job of getting to announce our webinar giveaway winners. This is pulled from just people that have been engaged in questions and the webinar in general. So thank you, winners, for being so proactive and really thinking about the topic at hand. So those three, and I'll also show you what you're winning. The first one is going to be Sherry. So Sherry, you've won this super cool King's tote bag. Congrats. And then Peter Montgomery, we've got this here phone wallet with our King's Lion on it. And then finally Emerson got this t-shirt. So congrats.
Now, are these fair trade or free trade products?
That's the question.
Yeah.
I guess that's
all right. We'll find out.
Yeah. So thank you again for being so involved. And I also just wanted to give a quick kind of word on King's and what we're about, just as background to the school. So we're located in New York City. We're in the financial district, about 1 block south of Wall Street. And King's, being in the city, is founded on the idea that to influence culture with the message and the power of Christ, we have to be where culture is, taking part in culture, creating new culture. And so with that in mind, we're here in the city as a Christian college, studying the classics, the great books, with a common core rooted in politics, philosophy, and economics, something that Dr. Mueller is a part of. But rooted in that with the idea that we can equip students to go on from that curriculum to their specific interest, which might be along that same line, and then from there into different internship opportunities or job opportunities in the city and around the world, with the idea of influencing culture wherever those students end up as alumni, with the power of Christ. So that's what the school is about, and I'd love to tell you more about it. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to the college. You can find us at tkc.edu, which is online. And now I think we're going to transition to some of that Q&A. So I'll pass it back to you guys, Natalia and Kim, and go from there. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tyler. And again, Dr. Mueller, we're going to transition into our live Q&A session now. So Kim is going to join us here on screen to facilitate that. One more quick note. If our giveaway winners could please drop their email addresses in the private chat, we will make sure that you receive your exciting prizes that you just saw on screen here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Kim Cromer and Dr. Mueller as they tackle these exciting questions that you've submitted.
Thanks, Natalia. Dr. Mueller, thank you so much for that informative presentation that you gave us. Our kids are super excited, and Natalia wasn't kidding about the questions pouring in. I think there are about 95 sitting here on my screen, so we'll work through those. We won't keep you here for all 95. We do realize that you probably would like to eat dinner, but we'll jump right in and get started. Just a little bit of background to this question. This season, our resolution for Lincoln Douglas is, when in conflict, governments should value fair trade above free trade. So with that context in mind, Sherry would like to know, what role does government have in fair trade and free trade?
That's a great question. So, so first, free trade can be a bit of a misnomer in the sense that, we just, just in the U.S., I think today they announced the new free trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Well, normally a real free trade agreement would be something along the lines of people in these countries may trade freely with each other, and that'd be the end of it. But instead, we have deals that are hundreds of pages long because it's not totally free trade. There are conditions and so on. So that's one thing to think about. Now, countries can have freer or less free trade in terms of the size of tariffs or taxes that they pass, whether they have restrictions on quotas or requirements that things be produced in certain parts of the world or certain labor. But I think the conflict then is that whether government should move towards reducing taxes, reducing quotas, reducing restrictions on production. That is to say, having fewer requirements that, for example, you're allowed to produce auto parts in Mexico, but only if people are paid at least $8 an hour or $10 an hour or something like that. So the free trade perspective would be that government should be removing and eliminating those kinds of restrictions, versus the fair trade model, I think, would actually advocate imposing more of those restrictions. So again, a lot of the fair trade model currently is sort of, I guess you could call it private. Like there's a labeling, licensing sort of international agency that does this. But you don't have to engage in fair trade. You don't have to pay for the label. You don't have to follow the different rules of what it means to be fair trade. And I think that opportunity to choose not to is actually really important. I think the worst thing we could do is to increase government requirements, legal requirements that restrict what people are allowed to produce and the ways in which they're allowed to produce it.
Okay. To follow that up on your comment about tariffs, one of the students would like to know, should a government use these tariffs to protect its national interest?
Again, good question. So there's been a lot of debate on this over the years. One challenging thing is defining the national interest. Very difficult. So what is the national interest? Is it that we can have more people working, making cars and making more money at the expense of everyone else paying much higher prices for cars? Is that in the national interest? Or having more steel companies as opposed to fewer steel companies that are making more money, again, at the expense of consumers? Is that in the national interest? So economically speaking, very difficult to argue that tariffs are in the national interest of the country. Now, you could make a national defense kind of argument. You could say that certain kinds of industries are important for national security. We don't want to export them. And we already do have restrictions on this. So for example, with military equipment, there are restrictions. There's not a free trade market in military equipment or military technology. People will argue that other industries are necessary for national security. And I tend to be on the skeptical side because people will advocate for things that benefit them. There's a story back, I think it's from the 1950s or 1960s, how the representative of a clothespin company testified before Congress and said that there should be tariffs on foreign clothespins to advance the national interest. And they asked him, well, why is that in the national interest? And he said, well, if there's competition and the American clothespin industry goes out of business, how are soldiers going to dry their clothes? I don't think Congress passed that, but you can see how people will make spurious arguments because it benefits them. So again, how do we think about this? I can understand certain restraints for defense technology, military technology sorts of things, but from an economic perspective, going all the way back to Adam Smith, this is what one of the things that made Adam Smith, the Scottish economist in the 1700s, really famous, was he basically laid out the case for free trade clearly, compellingly, and ever since then, economists, by and large, I mean, huge majority of economists have agreed that fair trade is far more beneficial economically than any kind of protectionism is.
Okay. So with that, if a government must choose, okay, because we set up this this debate, so if a government must choose between free trade and fair trade, are there any historical examples of those situations, and what did the government choose and why?
Are there historical examples of it? Well, if you look at the history of free trade agreements, so if you look at NAFTA or you look at the most recent deal, my understanding is you will find some components of fair trade elements in there. That is to say, some percentage of cars have to be manufactured within North America for it to count as being North American made, or a certain amount of the manufacturing has to be done by workers with making it above a certain wage. And again, the interests there at the political level tend to be to protect and benefit special interests, and it restricts competition in a number of ways. It's interesting that the prompt is about government involvement in this, because I was thinking about it in our current context of sort of a international licensing board as opposed to government doing it. But I think the government concerns, like the fact that the government is involved in the prompt, means that we should talk a lot more about general protectionist arguments. That there are concerns. I mean, currently we're living in a time where the president is advocating more tariffs and this kind of reasoning, and the concern is one about competitiveness. Whether people, workers in wealthy countries can compete with workers in poorer countries for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that their wages are so much lower. So again, in terms of historical examples, I would look at NAFTA and then the most recent trade deal. You might be able to, where else would we see this? Yeah, sorry, it's not coming to the top of my mind. Other countries have done this at different times. You might find something in German history. China has some rules like this, but it's not usually framed this way, because, like I said, fair trade is a newer issue, and so historically things haven't been framed in those terms of fair trade versus free trade. So excuse for not coming up with more examples. I apologize.
Sure, no, that's okay. Certainly, our students are wrestling through that as well, and we give them a number of resources that they can go back and look through, and we often refer them back to philosophers. You mentioned a couple in your presentation with Plosky and Hayek on the free trade side. Is there anything, even though it's a newer concept with fair trade, is there any concept back in what I would call ancient philosophers that could go and research?
Well, I'll think about that. What came to mind more recently is sort of the counterpart to Hayek in the 20th century is you can look up something called import substitution. And import substitution is the more technical economics literature about the effects of putting up tariffs or restrictions on trade and substituting domestic production for imports. So look up import substitution and you'll find some interesting things. In terms of more ancient philosophers on this, I hesitate to recommend them because they've been so discredited in the economics profession, but mercantilism is kind of a big part of this idea that President Trump has sort of brought back into the limelight. So if you look up mercantilism, you can look at a big advocate of this is Friedrich List in Germany. You can find other examples of this in Adam Smith's time in the 1700s and 1600s. Mercantilism, just the Cliff Notes version, is this idea that governments, that nations are competing with one another, including in trade, and the goal is to have a positive balance of trade. That is, you export more than you import. And the goal of that is if you export more than you import, you have this trade surplus, and the trade surplus means that more gold and silver is flowing into your country and out of the other country. So if you're England and you sort of, perennial rival France and you're trading, if you're England, you want to export more to France than you import from France because the difference has to be made up by gold and silver coming from France. And that means that England has more gold and silver, France has less, and that helps them in their military strength and in their manufacturing and political power and so forth. So that's the mercantilist idea. If you come here, you'll find out why it's completely wrong. But you can look at that as a place as well for some evidence.
Okay. That is really good. That'll be helpful to be able to learn to wrestle with the argumentation, that goes behind why free trade is a great idea versus fair trade. Okay, so let's dig down into a few of the questions that the students have in particular about fair trade. So when we talk about fair trade, are we talking about a movement or fairness that's really achieved by trade?
Okay, I think if I understand the question correctly, the question is the fairness that we want something that can be achieved by trade in general? And it's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things you'll have to wrestle with a lot, and there's a lot of poor thinking on this, is what we mean by fairness. Is like what is really fair. And so like my mindset is that fairness means that people have the freedom to compete and are not, constrained by governments or political actors or certifying agencies that are restricting what they're able to do. That strikes me as incredibly unfair. Now, some people think about fairness in terms of, fairness means that people have the standard of living I want them to have, or they have the same wages I have, or they have a similar lifestyle. And in those definitions of fairness, we just have to kind of really be clear about in what ways do we think people ought to be fair. Do they need to be fair in their opportunities and ability to engage in the market? Or do they need to be fair in the sense of receiving something from the market? And that's a very different kind of mindset. And it's one we're wrestling with, with entitlements. It's one we're wrestling with income and wealth inequality within the country as well as across. So I think by and large, freer trade has led to more equality. That is to say, despite what you see in the news, there are many ways in which people are more equal today than they have ever been in history. Even though there are super wealthy people, right? There's the super wealthy who have, tens of billions of dollars. It's just like an astronomical amount of money. But most of us, whether we're making $50,000 a year or $200,000 a year or $100,000 a year, our lifestyle in the U.S. is somewhat comparable. We all access the internet. We all have smartphones. We all have a huge variety of options of food. We all take vacations. Obviously we go to different places. But there's a remarkable amount of equality that's come about through trade and economic development that was just completely absent if you go back to the 15th century France. 15th century France, you've got the aristocrats and the elite who own the land, who own everything. And then you've got the serfs who are working the land. And the standards of living between those two groups was huge. Right. And so I guess I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but in terms of the fairness, I think equality comes into play. And I don't think we have much evidence, that fair trade really makes people more equal. But markets, markets can, even though they're not perfect. So I don't know. Sorry, I'm rambling here. It's been the end of a long day, but we'll go ahead with the next question.
Not at all. That is great. That's all helpful information. And sometimes exactly what our kids need comes from our musing. So thank you for doing that. So who would determine the standards for fair trades? How do you see that playing out? You mentioned a couple of companies or a couple of organizations like Fair Trade International. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question because that's kind of the challenge, I think, that you have to face with the fair trade, free trade. With free trade, nobody is deciding, right? Nobody is saying this is the right price or that's the right price or this is the way you need to do it. Instead, this is the price. Like, this is the market price for coffee, and you can take it or leave it. And that price is the result of thousands, or probably millions at this point, millions of buyers and sellers coming together, bringing their wares to market, going to buy, and that price emerges in sort of a decentralized fashion. And it just is. And it conveys information about the number of buyers and sellers and the demand and so forth. So that's the free trade model, decentralized. The price emerges through individual action, but nobody decides exactly what it is and says, this is the price, this is what you will get, this is the right price, this is the right way to do it. But fair trade, it's different. Fair trade, you have people who have to make a decision about, well, what's really fair? And in this case, you have a certifying board, Fair Trade International, and how they came to their standards, I'm not completely sure. I think some of them are humanitarian. So, for example, they generally take the perspective child labor is bad and wrong, and so that's going to be one of our conditions. They've also taken the position that we want workers to have some ownership over what they're doing, and so that means that you can only have the fair trade label if your farm is structured in a certain way, like a workers' cooperative sort of structure. And they think that's a good thing, that's something that is valuable. And then they think about what the price might be. So they want to set kind of a minimum price that they think is, leads to a decent standard of living. How they set that, there are different ways you can do it. There's a lot of subjectivity involved. But they kind of set that. They set it higher than the market rate often. And there is an element where it's not 100% arbitrary, but there are elements of arbitrariness to it. There's no objective standard written in stone about what the right price is for coffee, or about what the proper wage is for people working in Nicaragua growing coffee. There can be better and worse. Obviously, we'd love it if they were paid more. We'd love it if we were paid more. But we have to, economics as a discipline is about thinking about not just what would we like, what would be nice, but what are the actual constraints and options that we face, and how do we think about improving those options over time? What are the conditions and the rules and the mechanisms, markets and so forth, that promote greater development and innovation and improvement over time? So I think there's a strong contrast between free trade and fair trade in terms of who sets the standards for prices and how things are grown.
Okay. All right. Super helpful. So extension of that is, how much of an overlap do you believe there is between fair trade and really a protectionist mindset?
Well, unfortunately, I think there's a lot. It's not totally overlapped. I think there certainly are many people who get involved in fair trade, who buy fair trade, who are genuinely concerned about the economic well-being of farmers in poor countries. That certainly exists. But it's very easy for that sort of humanitarian concern to be a kind of mask for the economic interests and the business interests behind it. That in some ways, the fair trade coffee is less competitive than free trade coffee. And there are other ways in which protectionists can get on board with fair trade. And they do this all the time where, for example, labor unions advocate minimum wages all the time in the U.S., even though almost no one who's part of a labor union makes minimum wage or would be affected by the increase in minimum wage. And they lobby for minimum wages because they say, well, people should earn more money, they should have a higher standard of living. But in reality, what happens is labor union labor competes with lower skilled labor. And when you make lower skilled labor more expensive by increasing their price, the minimum wage, that makes the more expensive skilled union labor more attractive. That happens in the U.S. within a country, but that happens between countries. And so as we advocate for higher wages and higher prices to be paid, to farmers in other countries, we have to be very, very careful to make sure that what we're not doing is making them uncompetitive or less competitive relative to farmers in the U.S. or in the European Union or elsewhere. And there are a lot of farming interests at work in the background here. So it's not 100% overlap, but it's more overlap than I think we should be comfortable with.
Okay. Yes, I would say that's potentially very true. Okay, so I think maybe one final question, maybe two, depending on our time. A couple of questions about free trade. What's the most dramatic example of free trade? Our kids are always looking for that opening clincher. So what's the most dramatic example of free trade benefits that you can think of?
You're living in it. The United States of America, largest free trade zone in world history, largest free trade zone ever. And I'm not kidding when I say that it is probably the most important driver of the United States economic development in the 19th and 20th centuries, that you can trade between Michigan and Florida or Michigan and Texas. It's a big country, and you can trade between the states without paying tariffs, without facing quotas. And so you're living in the biggest free trade zone ever. European Union is also an example of this, where the formation of the Union has increased trade dramatically. You can also find some other examples. I like to point out Hong Kong as well, that there's not much at Hong Kong. They don't have many resources. They didn't start out very rich, and yet it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world because of trade. They didn't have natural resources that made them rich. They didn't have the location that made them particularly rich in terms of like, oh, everyone wants to live in Hong Kong because the climate's so nice. But it became a trading hub between China and the British Empire and India, and it was trade that made Hong Kong, that made Singapore. So those are some smaller examples, but I would definitely say United States is kind of the clincher that you might want to use here.
Right, and I agree with you. I think certainly we are living in the hotbed of free trade, and all benefit from that on a daily basis. In fact, here we sit, right, being able to have this great conversation. Dr. Mueller, thank you so much for finishing the end of your very busy day, I am certain, with us, sharing your expertise. It will be incredibly valuable to our students as they spend a whole season wrestling with free and fair trade, as they really learn to think about those kinds of things. So thank you again to you and to the King's College. We're super excited to be partnering with you all.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope some of what I said was helpful. So good luck going out and debating.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks. You're welcome.
All right, wonderful. That was a fantastic session with Dr. Mueller from the King's College, and we are excited that you were here with us. Natalia, would you like to do some wrap up for us?
Yes, thank you again, Dr. Mueller, and thank you to the King's College for being not only our sponsors, but also our giveaway providers for this session. Again, thanks to all of our attendees for your questions that you submitted. As always, you were a great audience. Know that this recording will be processed and sent out to you, uploaded to the NCFCA resource library so you can access it and rewatch it or share it with friends who weren't able to attend live tonight. So with that, we are going to wrap up this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email the office, and that email address is office@ncfca.org. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing you learn to communicate truth and transform culture together with us this year.